Ethics Untangled is brought to you by IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. To find out more about IDEA, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics. David Edmonds is a brilliant philosophical and biographical writer, not to mention an OG philosophy podcaster. If you haven't checked out any of Philosophy Bites' nearly 400 episodes, then you definitely should. His latest book is called Death in a Shallow Pond, A Philosopher, a Drowning Child and Strangers in Need. And it's about the fascinating history of a philosophical thought experiment, from its origins in the work of Peter Singer, through its influence on the effective altruism movement. In this conversation, we focus on some of the philosophical questions surrounding this thought experiment. Is it, as Singer claims, analogous to our own position with regard to distant others? And does it have the practical implications that he and the effective altruists have taken it to have? Welcome to the podcast, David.
Thank you for inviting me.
Topics covered in your new book, I suppose, so I might as well hold it up, even though this is an audio podcast. Maybe there'll be a clip with me holding up your book here. But it's Death in a Shallow Pond by David Edmonds, and it's about, well, it's kind of about a thought experiment, right? And about the implications of that thought experiment, both the philosophical implications and the kind of the real world effect that that thought experiment has had, I suppose. So I wondered if you could just kick things off by just telling us what is the Shallow Pond thought experiment and what lessons are we supposed to take from it?
Yeah, so it's a thought experiment which is quite old now. It goes back to 1971, so it's over half a century old, and it was invented by Peter Singer, arguably the most famous philosopher alive today, and it came at the time of what was called the Bangladesh War of Liberation. So what we now call Bangladesh was breaking away from the rest of Pakistan. There was a terrible civil war. Millions of people were flooding across the border into India. The Indian government couldn't cope. These people were starving, emaciated, diseased. The Indian government appealed for money. I think the British government paid about £15 million, which was, as Peter Singer pointed out, much less than the British government had spent on kind of Concorde, which was being developed at the time. And Singer wondered what the extent of our obligations were to those people on the other side of the world. So I'll just very quickly lay out what the thought experiment is. You are to imagine that you are walking past a shallow pond. You're on your way to work, perhaps. As you walk past this shallow pond, you hear the cries of a young child. You look around to see whether there's a guardian or whether there's a parent. You can't see anybody. So either you save the child or nobody does. You're about to wade in to save the child when you notice, back in 1971, it would be wearing your best brogues. In the year 2025, it would be perhaps wearing your most expensive Air Jordans. And they cost, I don't know, 150 quid, 200 quid. You're about to wade in when you realise that will ruin your shoes. And the rhetorical question Singer asks is, should you worry about your child, or should you worry about the child, or should you worry about the shoes? And it's a rhetorical question because, of course, everybody says, what an absurd question. Of course you should care about the child. And then Singer makes a big leap and he says, effectively, all of us are walking past a shallow pond every day of our lives. All of us in the affluent West with disposable income could easily afford to give away money to an international charity that would save a life. And by failing to do that, we are in effect no better than the person who worries about their Air Jordans rather than worrying about the child.
Mm. Yeah, okay. I think one thing that's striking about that thought experiment, as you said, it's a kind of rhetorical question, right? Whether you should save the child. And philosophical thought experiments are sometimes, well, one critique that's been made of philosophical thought experiments, and this is fresh in my mind because I've just been listening to the most recent episode of your podcast, Philosophy Bites, right, where you were interviewing a philosopher, Edouard Machery, and he's carried out all sorts of experiments where he's asked people for their responses to philosophical thought experiments. And in many cases, it turns out that what's supposed to be our natural response to these thought experiments isn't universally shared, right? But it doesn't seem like that's going to be a critique of this one, because it's just kind of obvious what you should do, right?
Yeah, so it is very interesting. The philosopher comes up with this thought experiment. There are lots of criticisms of the thought experiments. One is that often they are very bizarre and surreal. And if they're very bizarre and surreal, it's not obvious whether we should trust our intuitions. But a second one, which is one you've just pointed to, is that the philosopher assumes that everybody will share his or her intuition. And sometimes that's the case. So it turns out in the famous trolley cases where there's a runaway trolley, it's going to kill 5 people. You can turn the trolley down the spur so it only kills 1 person. It turns out that is fairly universalizable. That there aren't big demographic differences there, but sometimes there are. With the Peter Singer thought experiment, the one I've just articulated, it really doesn't suffer from many of those flaws. A, it's not very bizarre. You know, people drown all the time in ponds and lakes and seas. And B, you know, everybody will share this intuition that, of course, you should save the child rather than worrying about your shoes. The controversy is whether that is analogous with the real world.
Yes, absolutely. And we'll get onto some of the ways in which people have questioned whether it's analogous with the real world shortly. But first, I wanted to ask you about the kind of biographical element of this. So in the book, you write really interestingly about Peter Singer's life and kind of where this thought experiment sits in his overall kind of philosophical thought and his life and where that comes in. So I just wondered if you could say a bit about, I mean, why do you think we should be interested in the lives of philosophers as well as their ideas? And what do you think we can learn about this thought experiment and these ideas from Singer's life in particular?
Well, I mean, partly I wrote about the lives of philosophers just because I'm a gossip. I'm just interested in people's lives. You know, I'm just curious about where they came from. And Peter Singer has quite an interesting hinterland. He's the son of Viennese refugees. His grandparents died in the Holocaust. And there's a question to what extent his ideas sort of reflect his background. I think that's quite interesting. There's a broader question about whether biography is useful for understanding the philosophy. And I think sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. I mean, I think if you're interested in what Frege writes about logic and language, it's not necessarily very helpful to know what kind of life he led up to at that point. But on the other hand, if you take something like Wittgenstein and you're trying to interpret the only philosophical book he published in his lifetime, which is the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, it has a very puzzling kind of final section about ethics. And I think if you understand the kind of human being Wittgenstein was, and the kind of life he had led up to that point, that will help you interpret the last bit of that very famous books. So I think sometimes, not always, but I think sometimes it can be very important and relevant for trying to work out what the intention of the author was.
Okay. And in Singer's case, it's kind of notable that, you know, this is very action-oriented philosophy. It was really kind of, he really wanted to know what we should do in these very real situations, like the Bangladesh crisis that you talked about.
Yeah, whether that's reflected in his background, it's difficult to say. He himself is not sure about that. He's obviously an anti-racist, ironically, because he's often accused of having kind of eugenicist views. This is an absurd allegation, but because of his writings about disability, he's often faced demonstrations when he's spoken. But he very much believed from the beginning of his philosophical career that philosophy shouldn't be, I think, what he describes at some stage as a chess puzzle. It shouldn't be just kind of these nice little puzzles that you try and solve that really have nothing to do with the real world. No, he wanted to have a real impact on the world. And philosophers don't normally, even if they had that ambition, don't normally succeed in doing that. And one thing you can say about Peter Singer is unquestionably he's had an enormous impact on the world, not just with this thought experiment that we're discussing today, which first appears in this article called Famine, Affluence and Morality, and which has shaped philanthropy to a large extent, but also, of course, because in 1975 he wrote this book called Animal Liberation, which was the beginning of what we now think of as the animal rights movement. So in those two areas, he's had an enormous impact.
Yeah. Could you say a bit more then about the impact and the legacy that this thought experiment and the ideas that it expresses have had?
Yeah, so typically it was like any philosophical thought experiment, or indeed any paper published in a peer-reviewed philosophical journal, i.e. it was read by 150 people and ignored by the rest of the world. But, over time it began to... it was repeated in the philosophical literature, so it spawned a relatively large philosophical response. But then what happened 40 years after the publication of the article is that it was read by, separately, two young graduates. One was a guy called Toby Ord, who, like Peter Singer, grew up in Melbourne. The other was a Scotsman, Will MacAskill. They both separately read the article, both thought, this is very compelling, we need to act upon this. They then met, and in 2009 they launched what is now called the effective altruism movement. So the altruism bit is inspired by Singer, that we should do more for distant strangers. But they also gave it a spin, which is the effective bit. What they spotted, which Singer hadn't really noticed at all, and only starts writing about it really after they start writing about it, is that it's not just how much you give, but what causes you give it to. And what the effective altruism movement tries to do is persuade us to give to the most effective causes. Obviously, and we can get into this if you like, there's a problem about how you define what counts as effectiveness. But there are now a whole bunch of organizations looking at, for example, how much they need to save a life. And it turns out there's an enormous difference between the least effective and the most effective organizations. And perhaps even more important than how much you give is where you give that money to, what organization you give it to, whether you give it to effective organizations or not. So the effective organization was born in 2009. It encourages people to give 10% of their salary away and to give it away to the most effective causes.
Mm. So the way they try to work out what the most effective causes are is essentially through a lot of number crunching, right? So they're trying to... Well, they must have to make kind of judgments, value judgments almost, I suppose, about whether kind of an improvement in quality of life is equivalent to saving lives and those kinds of things. But a lot of it is just kind of saying, okay, £1 given to this charity is going to have this much effect versus £1 given to another charity, which won't have as much effect. Therefore, I should give it to the first charity. So I suppose one thing that people might think hearing about that kind of approach is that it seems a bit sort of robotic and making morality all about numbers in this kind of way. I mean, this is a vague sort of thought, but I think people maybe have an aversion to that kind of approach to morality generally. I mean, what do you think's lying behind that? And do you think it is something which is, has some, is it a valid worry about effective altruists?
So there are lots and lots of things to say about that. The first is, I don't think we worry about that approach when it comes from institutions. So, for example, a government, given the choice between spending money on putting up a traffic light in this place or putting up a traffic light in that place or putting up a speed controlling sleeping policeman in one area or putting up in another area, it's perfectly legitimate. Indeed, we'd be really shocked if governments didn't do this, if they looked at where was the most effective place to do this. If they want to stop car accidents, where's the most effective place to put the roundabout, the traffic light, the sleeping policeman? That just seems obvious to people and is obviously right. We're much more circumspect, or we recoil much more when that kind of approach is taken by individuals with their individual donations to charities. And there have been I have lots of this stuff in the book about the psychology of charity given. And it's really, really fascinating. The science of what drives us is very interesting. But it is the case that if you are faced with two people, one of whom has chosen to give charity on the basis of some kind of emotional appeal, let's say because they had a relative who was sick with a particular disease, and so they want to support a charity that helps combat that disease. Those people are judged more highly in terms of how virtuous they are than the people who allocate their money according to how much good they do. That's pretty weird, really, but that's just how we are. I've always been puzzled by why the effective altruists arouse so much, well, contempt, really, because, I've always been sort of sympathetic to them. I think they're idealistic, they're mostly young, they're not particularly, on the whole, well off, and they're very generous. But one reason I think, and I, again, in the book, have a section on coming up with a number of reasons why there's so much hostility towards them. But one reason is something that you point to, which is indeed that they seem to have a slightly alien approach to working out what good we should do. And it's not the natural way people think about doing good. The natural way people think about doing good is much more relational. It's to do with their lives, their projects, and so on, rather than being calculated in a kind of impartial way.
Yeah. And this perhaps brings us on to what I wanted to ask next, really, which is, so you raise a number of critiques against the effective altruists and against the supposed implications of the shallow pond thought experiment. And one is something you call the utilitarian critique, right? Now, this is a bit complicated because Singer is a utilitarian, but actually you don't have to be a utilitarian to draw the conclusions from the shallow pond thought experiment that many people have, right? But on that said, it does seem like the approach of the effective altruists would be something that would be vulnerable to a critique which has been made against utilitarianism and other kind of impersonal forms of moral theory. And perhaps most famously, at least within philosophical circles, by Bernard Williams, right? So Williams has this critique of impersonal forms of moral theory. I think he's got Kantianism in his sights as well as utilitarianism, right? It's not just utilitarianism, but it's kind of usually taken as being an attack on utilitarianism. And he says that those approaches are antithetical to integrity. And the way he thinks about integrity is something to do with one's personal projects. And the one way that he puts it, and you quote this in the book, is that there should be room for the source of someone's actions in their own convictions. And that making morality very impersonal in the way that utilitarianism and other similar theories seems to leave no room for that. Now, I think that's kind of interesting because actually, if you look at the effective altruists, they just look to me like really paradigmatic examples of people acting with integrity. And actually, the source of their actions is very firmly in their own moral convictions, right? They've read this thought experiment or read Singer's work and they've become convinced of a moral point of view and they've really followed it to its logical conclusion. That just looks like integrity to me. But I can also see where someone like Williams might be coming from, right? Where it seems like because utilitarianism really demands everybody acts in the same way, it does seem that it doesn't leave so much room for a more kind of personally grounded approach to morality. So how do you understand that critique, and do you think it's got some validity?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there. So I think your listenership will be unusually well informed, but utilitarianism is the view that you should maximize happiness or well-being. The principle that Singer derives from the shallow pond thought experiment is this. If you can prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing anything of moral significance or of equal moral significance, then you should. So in the shallow pond, you can prevent somebody dying and all you're sacrificing is your shoes. So clearly you should sacrifice your shoes to save a life. But he doesn't fill in what counts as moral significance. Now, it's open to a Kantian to say that moral significance is not lying, not committing fraud, keeping your promises. It's also open to somebody to say moral significance is giving special a privilege to your children, to your parents, to your friends and family. That is not precluded from Singer's principle. So it's open to somebody to say, if I had to sacrifice my children for 2 other lives, that is of moral significance for me, and the principle does not demand that. So the principle is not a utilitarian principle. Having said that, Singer is a utilitarian. Quite a few of the effective altruists are utilitarian. Some are not. Quite a few of them are. You point to various criticisms that Bernard Williams makes about utilitarianism, and I liked your defense of effective altruism. So Williams has this idea. He has lots of thought experiments. One is about George the biochemist, who hates the development of biochemical warfare, but is in desperate need of money. His family need the money. He's, I think, out of work. He's offered a job in the biochemical arms industry, and he's told that if he doesn't take it, somebody else will take it, who will work even harder than he will to develop these weapons. And William says, well, from a utilitarian point of view, it's clear that he should take the job. It's better for his family. It will slow down the development of these weapons compared to the person who would take the job if he didn't take the job. From a utilitarian point of view, it looks like he should take it. But that seems absurd because his whole project is to be opposed to these weapons and the industry, and yet utilitarianism seems to demand that he operates in it. But as you say, I think the defense for the effective altruists is that their work and their lives are totally aligned with what they're trying to do. They believe in maximizing the good, at least with the portion of the money that they allocate to charity. So insofar as they take a job that does that maximizes their income so they can give away lots of their money, that's completely aligned with their project. So it's not clear that their integrity is undermined in any way.
Yes, I think that's right. But I suppose maybe the worry comes out more if you think about kind of what the critique that effective altruists would make of somebody who didn't share their convictions. So I think at least some of the effective altruists have taken it further than just saying you should donate a portion of whatever money you earn, but they're saying actually you should try and earn as much as you possibly can in order to have more money to give away, and therefore you can be more effective, right? So if you're faced with a choice, kind of similar, I suppose, to the, Williams's example, but somewhat different, a choice between, I don't know, becoming a nurse or working with kind of vulnerable children or something like that, versus becoming a hedge fund manager in order to earn more money and have more money to give away. You should become a hedge fund manager, and you're kind of doing something wrong if you take the other choice, right? And that does seem like it's a bit, at least, counterintuitive to some people.
It's definitely counterintuitive. So at the same time that they were thinking about how much money people should give away, they recognized that in addition to our money, we also had our time. So if we were interested in doing the best we could, at least with some of our portion of our lives, impartially, then we should think about how we spend our time as well as how we spend our money. And so a organization called 80,000 Hours was born, 80,000 being the number of hours that we roughly spend in a typical career from the beginning to the end. And the organization advises people on how they should spend their time. And traditionally, people who wanted to do good would go and work for Oxfam, and they would sell secondhand clothes. And the counterintuitive element of 80,000 Hours was that it might be the case that you shouldn't do that you should go and work for the hedge fund. I mean, they wouldn't recommend that you go and work necessarily for the arms industry. There are some constraints on this, but let's say that you think there's an industry which isn't kind of necessarily innately evil, but generates a lot of money, that maybe if you're capable of doing that, that would be the best thing to do. I think there's a difference between an instrumental and an ultimate objective. So what is the ultimate objective of the effective altruist? The ultimate objective is to maximize the good with the portion of their money that they're allocating to the good. So if that's the ultimate objective, the fact that the instrumental way of reaching that is through a hedge fund rather than through working for Oxfam is a matter of indifference to them. If they really want to help people, and this is the best, most effective way of helping people, then I can see why that's not a great concern for them. The problem with Bernard Williams' example, and the difference, is that the George is not interested in maximising well-being. He just doesn't want to work for an arms industry. So I think there is a difference between those two cases.
Yes, yeah, that seems right. Yeah. Okay. Another critique then that you raise and discuss in the book is the demandingness critique. Right. So the thought here is, well, I suppose it's a way in which one might think that the shallow pond thought experiment isn't really analogous to our own predicament with regard to kind of people in need. The shallow pond thought experiment relies on the cost to us of saving one child, which is very low. It's just like, we'll damage our trainers or whatever. But actually, there are children drowning in shallow ponds everywhere. And it's as it is evidenced by the effective altruists and the way they've kind of shaped their lives around these ideas, actually what's demanded of us is much greater than just saving one child. Yeah, so could you say a bit about that critique and whether you think it's a telling critique?
Firstly, when Peter Singer comes up with this thought experiment in 1971, published in 1972, he discusses kind of mudding your suit, ruining your shoes, as though shoes, had you sold them, could have saved a life. And let's say, even the most expensive shoes, only 150 quid. People now think that's a massive underestimate. So people now think that the most effective charities, they don't require 150 quid. They require, I think they say $5,000, which is about £3,500. So much more than Singer initially thought. But as you say, there is this problem, which is, you imagine that it's Monday morning, you're going to work, you go past a shallow pond, there's somebody drowning. Of course, you should sacrifice your Air Jordans to save a life. You go to work, you've done your good deed, you return home, you go to work the next day on Tuesday morning, and there's somebody else in the shallow pond. You're wearing your backup pair of Air Jordans, and now you've got to sacrifice those Air Jordans as well. And it looks like you have to do this every day. Because so long as you genuinely can save a life, surely that's at every moment more important than your Air Jordans. And that does seem to be even more counterintuitive than some of the things we've been discussing so far, because it just seems to demand and demand and demand and demand. And so there's not only is there little money left for you to spend on a nice bottle of wine or whatever, but there's also little time to pursue your other projects, because you have to spend all your time thinking about those who are in desperate need. And so that is the problem. It's less a problem for the effective altruist than it is for Peter Singer, because the effective altruist ask us to donate up to 10%. And that leaves 90% of our income and our time or whatever free to do what we want. So there's a kind of natural ceiling on what effective altruism demands of us. But because Singer is a utilitarian and bites every utilitarian bullet, he is indeed hit by this demandingness problem. And so at every stage in his life, when he's spending money on a meal or an expensive meal, he's got to eat, he's got to survive. But when he's spent money needlessly on a nice meal, or when he's buying a bottle of wine when he could have a glass of water, that money could be better spent elsewhere. And it is a real problem for him, and he acknowledges that. So he gives a very large percentage of his salary away, but he thinks he doesn't give nearly enough away. I think he gives up to 50%. He's got plenty of money left. He was a Princeton professor, so, he's not living in poverty. But yeah, he thinks he should be doing much more. But to most people, they think, surely by giving 50% of your money away, you've done your bit. It's asking too much of morality to expect you to to do any more. But the shallow pond thought experiment does seem to suggest that you should keep giving and giving and giving and giving and giving.
Yeah, and do you think that there's a defence against that the effective... Well, you say it's less of a problem for the effective altruist, but do you think Singer has a defence against that problem, or is it just a matter of biting the bullet, as you say?
Singer bites the bullet. There's a lovely paper which I discuss, which you will have read about, the green button, which comes from a guy called Theron Plummer, and it's a beautiful thought experiment. He imagines that there's a green button, and I forget the exact details, but if you don't press it every 1 minute, somebody will die. And this actually thought experiment just repeats what I said, because it looks like at every moment, the most important thing you can do is to be stuck by that green button. But if you look at a life globally, you're effectively demanding that somebody spends their entire life chained to that green button. And when you look at a life globally, as opposed to at a one moment in time, it's clear that it seems that's the paradox. At every moment in time, obviously, the best thing you can do is press the green button. But stand back, look at the whole life. Surely you can't expect somebody to spend their entire life chained to the green button. And I think that's the intuition which I was trying to describe beforehand.
Yeah. I suppose perhaps the response that at least that the effective altruists have is to say, I mean, at least insofar as it's the version of effective altruism which only demands that we give 10% of our income, right? That seems like that's not going to be vulnerable to that attack, because 10% is not going to meet that threshold for being over demanding.
Sure. And it was chosen for that very reason, that 10% is very demanding, but not overly demanding. It wouldn't radically transform our lives. It would be 9.5% more than most people give. But it's not radically transformative in the way that being tied to the green button for the rest of your life would be.
Yeah. Okay. So let's just discuss one more objection. And you can tell me if this is wrong, but it seems to me that it's the objection that you think is perhaps most serious as a critique of the effective altruists. And it's an empirical objection, essentially. And it basically says that the altruism that the effective altruists are engaged in isn't as effective as they think it is. And it comes from the work of some academics critiquing aid as a way of improving outcomes for people in the developing world and so on. And it basically just says that actually those approaches aren't really very effective and actually might be doing more harm than good. So why do people think that? And am I right that you think that that's quite a serious objection?
Yeah, I think this is an objection that one needs to take very seriously. And it's difficult for me, not an economist, to critique or second guess people who've devoted their entire lives to analysing the effects of aid. And there's a great variety of opinion amongst development economists about how effective or ineffective aid is. And at one extreme, you've got somebody who was extremely helpful to my book, Angus Deaton, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, who thinks aid is very ineffective. And obviously, it's quite a complicated argument, but the basic critique is that when you interfere in the affairs of another country, you are somehow breaking a contract between the government and the citizen. The government ceases to need to be accountable to the citizen because the NGO or another government has stepped in to do the job that the government should be doing. When that happens, the government, because it doesn't need to be accountable because somebody else is doing their work, can divert its attention and its resources to really objectionable stuff like warfare, corruption, and so on. One of the problems in this whole empirical area is the effective altruists will look at something like funding for malaria nets. And they'll look at how many people used to die of malaria, now are dying of malaria as a result of malaria nets and so on. And that's a kind of spotlight on a particular problem. But of course, by doing that, you're missing the big picture, which is so maybe it's the case that we acknowledge that these certain charities are doing very good in these particular areas, but maybe there's something bad going on in the background as a result of this, which is to do with some of the things I was talking about, like feeding corruption and breaking the local health system, or not making the local health system as robust as it otherwise would be. And those are the things that are not being measured by these organizations because they're very difficult to measure, and because they are spotlighting very particular charities working in very particular areas. So that's the critique. I do think we should take it very seriously. When it comes to the shallow pond, you know that if you jump into the shallow pond, you can rescue the child. When it comes to giving money to an international charity, the contention by some of these development economists is you certainly can't guarantee that it will save a child. In fact, it might encourage more people to jump into shallow ponds, or it might stop governments putting fences around shallow ponds to stop people jumping into shallow ponds in the future. It might have all those bad effects.
Yeah. I suppose in one way of looking at it is that it's an example of something that we see all the time, which is might call it the tyranny of the measurable, right? It's like they measure these things because they're easy to measure, and then that ends up kind of defining how they channel their activity. So it's something we see in public policy quite a lot, right? The things that are very difficult to measure end up not being the focus of people's attention so much.
And I think in a way that's understandable as a bias, because if you can measure something, well, you've got some empirical evidence that it works, whereas randomized controlled trials looks like they can spot which factors are effective, but there are some things which may be much more effective, which you can't measure so well. So one example is the kind of health system you have. Should it be insurance-based? Should it be funded entirely by taxation? Should it be privately funded? It's very difficult to work out if you shifted from one system to another, whether it would have good effects or not. It's much easier to measure whether you give vitamin tablets to people in a particular village, whether it will have beneficial effects. And as you say, that it's the tyranny of the measurable, exactly.
Yeah. I suppose you might say that the response then for the effective altruists is to say, well, that's a very important critique, and it's something that needs to be taken seriously. But it's an objection to the application of the ideas. It's not an objection to the ideas themselves, right? So you might say, okay, well, the implication of that is if we want to be really effective, we need to take much more seriously these other effects that we might have been missing. But still, if we can be really sure that we're going to be able to help people in a certain way without implicating all these other effects, then we should do so.
Absolutely. Totally correct. It might mean a shift of emphasis so that if we think that it has bad effects far away, maybe we should be doing our bit to improve well-being or whatever close by, if that's more reliable. So absolutely, it doesn't undermine the principle. It's purely an empirical objection.
Mm. Okay, just one last question then, and you've already touched on this, but I thought it's worth asking again. But one thing that is really notable is that a lot of the objections that have been made against Singer and the effective altruists go beyond just reasoned disagreement, right? And they get hate mail, and there are people seem to be kind of disgusted by these ideas more than just disagreeing with them. Why do you think that is? Because that's quite unusual for philosophical ideas, right? They don't tend to prompt that kind of emotional reaction. Why do you think their approach prompts anger and contempt in some people? And is any of that justified?
So I don't have an answer I'm fully confident about. I speculate about that. I think it's partly because they hold a mirror up to the rest of us. And none of us like that. So even if they don't go around preaching, we sort of know that they're giving this money to charity, and we're not. So they're implicitly sort of condemning us, even if they're not articulating that. I compare it to when I became a vegetarian a very, very, very long time ago, when there weren't many vegetarians. And I had the same response from my parents' generation at the time, which is they just got very angry about it. I didn't try and convert anybody, but my making this moral choice was implicitly a condemnation of their choice. And that's right, it was. I was making a moral choice. It was implicit condemnation, even if I didn't say so to their faces. So I think it's partly that, but there must be more to it than that. So I'm intrigued by the fact that nobody who works in Oxfam in a bookshop or a charity bookshop, a charity clothes shop, nobody is subject to this kind of contempt. It's only the people who give their money away are subject to it. And I think it's partly, I came up with lots of answers. It's partly because of something we talked about earlier, that there's something sort of uber rational about their approach, and so it's like something very alien to the way most of us think about the world.
Great. Well, that's all we've got time for. So, David Edmonds, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Ethics Untangled, a podcast from IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. IDEA brings ethics to life, blending in-depth theoretical inquiry with real-world experience to address the most complex ethical issues facing the world today. If you like the podcast, please leave us a rating and review. And to find out more about IDEA, including our Masters and PhD programmes and a wide range of consultancy services we offer, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.